Hey, it's Jessica Goose here with Real Agriculture, and I am at the Crop Sphere Conference in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Joining me right now is Charles Geddes, who is a research scientist in weed ecology and cropping systems with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Charles, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you very much.
Well, this is a great time to talk about managing herbicide-resistant weeds in Western Canada, and that's what your presentation was on. I think this is something that farmers obviously should be thinking about going into the 2020 cropping season. So to start off here, what are we seeing as far as trends when it does come to herbicide resistance over the prairies?
Right. So my presentation at the conference here covered essentially what we call the Prairie herbicide-resistant weed surveys. So it's a series of surveys that have been conducted over time since the early 2000s. And essentially these surveys document the incidence of resistance over time. Mm-hmm. So first of all, looking at in which weed species we find herbicide-resistant weed biotypes, but also are we seeing increased incidence. Mm-hmm. So in general, what we're seeing is herbicide resistance is increasing on the prairies. Currently, we're sitting at, in Saskatchewan, we're sitting at 57% of fields have a herbicide-resistant weed biotype. So we're now at the point where it's more likely that a field has herbicide resistance than it does not, which is kind of a shocking number.
Yeah, no kidding. That's definitely, I mean, obviously over half, I think that's huge. And what are the other provinces seeing?
So we're seeing in Alberta, it's at about 59%, and then in Manitoba, it's actually at 68%. Wow. So currently, Manitoba is kind of in the lead of the prairie provinces,
of a race that you don't really want to be in. Now, what do you think is causing this rise?
So, in general, it's selection pressure from repeated use of herbicides without other weed control measures, right? So we've basically, resistance has been building over time since the 80s, really, in Canada, right? So, or in Western Canada. We've seen this sort of slow build, and it's kind of been a steady build over time.
But still, the numbers add up.
Yeah, so across Canada, we're sitting at about 75 what we would call unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. And what I mean by that is a weed species that is resistant to a herbicide mode of action. So we're sitting at 75 across Canada. And in the prairie provinces, unique biotypes within each prairie province, we're sitting in the low 20s for each province.
Low 20s, whoa. So what are the big challenges, I guess? Is there a certain weed that sticks out, or a couple of them?
Yeah, for sure. So the big challenges moving forward are certainly multiple resistance. So where we're seeing weed species that have resistance to multiple herbicide modes of action. One of the main ones across the prairies is wild oat. So in wild oat, certain biotypes can have resistance to group 1, 2, or 8 herbicides. And in some cases, there was a population from Manitoba that also had 14s and 15s on top of that.
Whoa, that's a lot.
So the most common type of resistance in wild oat is group 1 resistance. And group 1 herbicides are what we would call our in-crop graminicides. So essentially they selectively manage grassy weeds out of grassy crops. And that is group 1 resistance in wild oat is the most common type of resistance. And then in a close second is group 2 resistance in wild oat as well.
But to see that 8 and 14, 15, that's not common.
That is not as common that we know of at this point. So the last survey that we have for group 8 or trilate resistance was done back in 2007 to 2009, which showed an incidence of resistance in Saskatchewan at about 3% of fields where wild oat was collected, and that compares to Alberta that had 15% of fields.
Wow. I'm also going to take a wild guess here that Kosho is also kind of a big player in this.
Of course, yeah. So especially over the last few years, Kosho is becoming an increasing problem in the southern area of the prairies. So for Kosho, basically the story is back in 1988, we found the first herbicide-resistant Kosho on the prairies. And that was resistant to group 2 herbicides. And over the course of about 20 years, that type of resistance spread to now we essentially consider all kochia populations on the prairies resistant to Group 2 herbicides. And then after that, in 2011, we found the first glyphosate-resistant kochia. And to date, kochia is the only glyphosate-resistant weed that we have in Western Canada. So the first cases were found in chemical fallow fields that were just south of Lethbridge, Alberta. And the baseline survey in Alberta was conducted in 2012 and then also repeated in 2017.
Okay.
So the 2012 survey identified glyphosate resistance in about 5% of the kochia populations in the province. And then when it was repeated in 2017, after 5 years, the incidence of resistance went from 5% to 50% of the populations in 2017.
Wow.
So glyphosate resistance in kochia is spreading quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely on the uphill.
And that's also backed up by some of our recent data in Manitoba as well, where the baseline survey in 2013 identified 1% of the populations resistant to glyphosate. And then the 2018 survey identified about 59% of the kochia populations in Manitoba.
Whoa, that's a jump.
So glyphosate resistance is spreading very quickly in kochia.
Yeah.
And on top of that, more recent research has also identified synthetic auxin resistance, which is the Group 4 resistance. So kochia populations that are resistant to dicamba, the current stat for Alberta is about 18% of the populations in Alberta have synthetic auxin resistance, and about 10% of the populations have triple resistance to Group 2, 4, and 9 being glyphosate.
So we got to do something about this, obviously, and it's all going towards management. And really, what is there for wild oats and kochia? Maybe start with wild oats first.
Sure, yeah. So for wild oats, the unfortunate fact is that Group 1 and 2 resistance is now becoming quite common, and often it ends up being blanket resistance to all of the active ingredients within each mode of action. So we're sitting at, in Saskatchewan, about a quarter of the fields that where wild oat is sampled are resistant to both Group 1 and 2 herbicides. And when you have that certain biotype in your field, your herbicide options become very limited. In fact, in wheat, barley, field pea, and lentil, we're actually limited down to only use of pre-emergence herbicides. So there's really no post-emergence options left for wild oat that is resistant to both Group 1 and 2 herbicides.
Whoa.
So our herbicide programs are going to be shifting to relying on pre-emergence herbicides. So there are some options as far as pre-emergence herbicide management of wild oat in those crops. But in addition to those pre-emergence herbicides, as far as keeping ahead of the kochia, growers are going to have to rely on including other types of management, like either cultural management or mechanical weed management within their crop as well.
Those are kind of the only options that are going to be left, especially when you have multiple resistance on there. Like you said, it's not just like a 1 or an 8. You got almost 4, like you said, or 4 or 5 in Manitoba already, and
Exactly.
I'm sure if it's popping up there, it's going to slowly make its way.
It may, hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. Crossing our fingers right now, but unfortunately, that's what happens when there is that resistance there.
Yeah. So one of the things as far as management for wild oats is, as I mentioned, shifting more to pre-emergence herbicides, preferably something that has a little bit of residual activity, right? But research has shown sort of time and time again that especially in small grain cereals, increasing your seeding rates is one of the best things that you can do as far as competing with weeds. So I think that if we can integrate some of these pre-emergence herbicides with higher seeding rates, probably up to double the recommended seeding rate for either wheat or barley, I think that will go a long way to helping compete with wild oats as well.
And when it comes to management for kochia, what are we looking at for that?
So as far as kochia is concerned, if you have multiple resistant kochia, your herbicide options become quite limited. There are still a few options as far as management of multiple resistant kochia in crops like small grain cereals. However, your options are decreased to only 1 or 2 herbicides that are available, which is not the best thing as far as a herbicide rotation perspective.
No, for sure.
So for Kosho, currently our research group is leading a large project on managing Kosho in the prairies. And some of the things that we're looking at are the impact of crop rotation diversity and also the diversity of herbicide options that come along with that, right? And some other things like integrating what we would call an alternate crop life cycle, right? So in rotations that are predominantly summer annual crops, throwing in a winter annual like winter wheat could go a long way to helping compete with Kosho, because you would have essentially a crop that's already established in the spring while Kosho is trying to emerge.
So you're not exactly hooped. There are options, but you have to look at it pretty seriously.
You certainly do. You have to be, if you know that you have these biotypes within your field, you really have to plan ahead and make sure that you have a solid management strategy moving forward. With Kosho, the weak point is the seed bank. So Kosho has limited seed bank longevity. So the seed bank usually persists for 1 or 2 years. So the idea is that if you can manage the resistant biotype effectively for a few years in a row, that will go a long way to depleting your seed bank and depleting the populations in subsequent years.
Hopefully no more. If you can do the right things, if you can find the right recipe, basically.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah. Anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think I'm good. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much.